Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca, co-founder of the research project System of Systems, along with Danai and Maria. We're pleased to welcome you to this evening's programme, Migration, Extraction and Climate, sharing the work of researchers, activists and artists who are each uniquely exploring critical ways of demonstrating how ecological dilapidation and colonialism have been central forces in shaping contemporary migration politics and migratory flows. Before introducing this evening's theme, ourselves and our speakers, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Arts Catalyst for collaborating with us and facilitating this event. We're huge admirers of the ambitious work Arts Catalyst have been doing to address the most pressing issues that contemporary society faces, not only in relation to the climate crisis, but also through commissioning transdisciplinary art and research to encourage new ideas, conversations and experiences across all aspects of science and culture. Since 2016, through System of Systems, we've been collaborating with a wide range of practitioners to explore the use of technology and bureaucracy in the asylum-seeking process in Europe. Our research specifically focuses on the system, or systems, that produce and process migration under the pretense of security. More recently, we have begun exploring more intersectional approaches to understanding the structures that shape migration. For example, and namely here, the inseparable issue of climate dilapidation as a major force in propelling displacement, which has become a core theme in our ongoing research. To explore this issue further, we're very honoured to be joined by a group of speakers who address this issue in quite different ways in their work. Radha D'Souza, a social justice activist and law specialist, Angela Chan, artist and curator of the project Worm, Art and Ecology, Nabil Ahmed, scholar, writer and researcher, and Nadine El-Enany, lecturer in law. In recent years there has been a major shift towards a broader societal acceptance that the planet is experiencing a climate crisis, yielding cataclysmic and irreversible effects on human and non-human species and on the very ecosystem itself. A central turning point in this more widespread acceptance is often pinpointed at the formation of the Paris Agreement in April 2016, which brought the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change into common political parlance, and began tackling greenhouse gas emissions, mitigation, adaptation and finance. Decades before this issue was foregrounded in politics, climate justice campaigners, indigenous and aboriginal researchers and activists, and those inhabiting places worse affected by the crisis, primarily in the global south, have been calling for its recognition, yet have long been ignored. Dominant political narratives continue to dispute such groups' position on how far back one can trace the crisis, and therefore what factors caused this issue. Visual culture scholar T.J. Demos connects colonial histories with today's ecological crisis, determining that the connection of the two hemispheres inaugurated the modern capitalist world system, therefore the foundations of resource extraction, based upon imperial conquest, slavery, and much suffering and death. Or, as Julieta Singh writes in Unthinking Mastery, quote, "This is a moment in which human-induced ecological catastrophe is both in effect and imminent, in which human population displacement and species extinctions have become normative expectations. It is a moment, in other words, when human practices of mastery fold over onto themselves and collapse. Therefore extraction, placed here in the middle of tonight's programme title, may serve as a nexus from which to think about the ongoing relation between migration, colonialism and climate, the links between contemporary fossil capitalism, imperialism and the treatment of those who are displaced as a result, demonstrate a shared rendering of non-renewable resources and migrant bodies as disposable and therefore lesser. Outside of the theoretical debate, and perhaps more urgently, there is currently no policy recognising the existence of climate refugees. The UN's 1951 Refugee Convention specifies that only those who have, quote, a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, qualify as a refugee, not those who have been uprooted as a result of ecological disaster. A World Bank report released in April 2019 estimates that climate change could force more than 140 million people to migrate internally, within sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and South Asia alone by 2050. The UN predicts a similar number might be displaced globally just by desertification by 2045. A step towards concretizing these drastic figures at a policy level was made in July 2018, when the first document published by the UN to include climate change in work aligned with refugees was published. The paper, called the UN Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, is not yet legally binding, with many calling for a quicker legislative and bureaucratic response. Our 4 speakers have each produced a short talk loosely framed by a set of questions that we posed in relation to their own current research. These included questions such as, how can the narrativization of crisis in the context of migration and climate be thought together, their convergence no longer ignored as a consequence of colonial histories? What does the word crisis do, mean or produce in these 2 intersecting contexts? What are the limitations of existing asylum law in recognizing the impact of displacement caused by climate issues? Should we seek legal changes? How do anthropocentric approaches to the crisis obscure gross inequalities and the powered interests behind them? We hope you will join us for the live Q&A following the presentations and enjoy the thought-provoking talks by our speakers.
Our first speaker for this evening is Radha D'Souza. Radha D'Souza is a professor of international law, development and conflict studies at the University of Westminster. She has also taught law at the University of Waikato in New Zealand and development studies, sociology and human geography at the University of Auckland. She practiced law in the High Court of Mumbai in the areas of labour rights, constitutional and administrative law, public interest litigation and human rights. She is a social justice activist from India, where she worked with labour movements and democratic rights movements, as organiser and as an activist lawyer. This evening, Radha will present a brilliantly wide-spanning overview of how notions of crisis are produced within and outside academia, and how crises come to be produced, named and managed. Offering a theoretical framework for how to engage in an understanding of both features of migration and climate as inseparable from capitalism, shaping societies across the globe. Over to Radha.
Greetings, everyone. I want to begin by thanking Systems of Systems for inviting me to this panel. And this panel on migration, extraction, and climate actually is symptomatic, or this problem about migration, extraction, and climate is symptomatic of bigger and more fundamental questions in our society. Today, I will in order to just help us put this issue into perspective, I will just give a brief kind of a sketch of, or a snapshot rather, not even a sketch, a snapshot of the kind of world that we live in today. The world that we live in today, about 8% of the population, I think the world's population is some 7.6 billion, and 8% of these people live in the rich countries, call it European, call it Western, call it developed countries, global North, core, whatever you want to call it, yeah, depending on your theoretical, ideological preferences. And 92% of the world lives in the rest of the world. Call it global south, call it underdeveloped, call it poor countries, call it neo-colonial, colonial, whatever you like. And that means that in today's world, 92% of the population works to keep what we call the European way of life or the American dream and so on. Yeah. And this reality of our existence must be borne in mind because it gives us perspective to everything that we talk about. But I'm not going to talk about data and facts and figures and all that kind of thing. We have become very used to this accounting logic, to the statistical thinking. Yeah? And the statistical reasoning and statistical logic is part of a deeply embedded modern knowledge system. And it is that very thing that has brought us to the crisis that we are in today. And therefore, even to start thinking about the question and the crisis and the reasons for that, we need to step back from statistical reasoning. And if you are in a university, you will know that most university research funding organizations will ask you for evidence-based research. And it is just this kind of evidence-based research that has brought us to a problem or to the crisis that we are in. How much data do you need to understand that if you throw bombs, people will die? How much data do you need to understand that if corporations take land, people will not have land to grow food and feed their families? You don't need too much for that. But that is precisely the kind of knowledge trap that we are kept in. I'm reminded of Albert Einstein, and he famously said that you cannot find solutions for your problems at the same level of thinking that produced the problems. You cannot find solutions to problems by remaining at the same level of consciousness that created the problem. And this is the big crisis in thinking that is stopping us from moving beyond just an understanding, what is quite obvious to many, to actually thinking differently about how we can approach those problems or issues. Now, when we are not able to understand the world we live in and how it works and how it operates, then there is cognitive dissonance. The concepts don't make sense, things don't add up. Let's take, for example, the environmental crisis. We are living through like two major angst. Yeah? One is the environmental crisis. This feeling that, the world is going to, change, and the conditions that we need for life will no longer be there because of climate, because of resource depletion, and all those things. On the other hand, we have this problem of human migration. People wash up on the shores of Europe. What do we do? How do we deal with it? Do we just close our borders and say we want our European way of life? But then our European way of life, we know that depends on all those people, but we don't want too many of them coming here. And we definitely don't want children like Aylan Kurdi washing up on our shores, because that questions our basic humanity. It challenges our basic humanity, and the basic humanity is also part of European values. So we get into a real conceptual trap, and there is dissonance. And this conceptual dissonance, it produces dystopia. So you'll see that everywhere around, films, writings, academic writings, everywhere, the sense of hopelessness. And that is why I am not going to deal with facts, figures, and statistical reasoning, evidence-based arguments, etc. Instead, I want to draw your attention to certain core conceptual issues that are holding us back from the problems that we already know and we already recognize. Now, the first issue that I want to flag up is the question of capitalism. Now, capitalism has become like a shorthand for many things that are wrong. Why are things wrong? Oh, it's because of capitalism. And capitalism has become like a bogeyman. But what is this capitalism? What is the core of this capitalism? And the core of this capitalism is commodity production. It's a social order based on commodity production, yeah, where everything must become a commodity before it can be used or enjoyed or whatever. So from a bar of soap to a woman's womb, everything is subject to buying and selling. Everything is a commodity. It can be bought and sold. It can be subject of contract. So this must be borne in mind when we talk about capitalism. How does this issue relate to commodities and commodification and commodity relations? Now, closely related to that, how did we become a commodity producing a social order? Yeah. And here I come to the second conceptual issue that I want to flag up, which is the rupture between nature, our relationships to nature, and our relationships to each other. This rupture I call the original sin of capitalism. It's the original sin because capitalism starts, and this is how it becomes a social order, by alienating, by evicting, through violently evicting people from nature and violently disbanding communities, that is, people's relationship with each other. Marx, of course, talks about it in much more beautiful way than I can ever hope to do. And this displacement of people from nature turns nature into property and property relations, and turns people into labor and labor relations, or civil society relations, if you like. And we have the labor markets where labor must be sold, and we have the property markets, whether it is forestry or mining or whatever, land markets where nature can be bought and sold. But what happens when this original sin is committed? It pushes people away from places and it installs them in modern institutions. And that brings me to my third conceptual question, which is about modern states and modern institutions, of which states and corporations are two most fundamental and essential institutions. Now, by states, I must emphasize I'm referring to the modern state. The modern state is not to be conflated with the feudal state or the ancient states, which were also states, but they were quite different. And these two institutions are two sides of the same coin. They are two sides of the same capitalist coin. And yet, in our attempts to find solutions, we keep going from one to the other. We say, oh, states must fix the problem of corporate plunder, and then when states don't do that or do other things, we say, oh, but states are interfering in our lives. They are, manipulating our lives, and we don't want the states to do that. So do we want the states? Do we don't want the states? Same thing with the corporations. Corporations give us jobs, so we want the investment. We want them to produce clean, green energy, all of that. But at the same time, we don't want them to exploit resources, to extract minerals, to displace people, etc. So you can see the kind of dissonance that it creates. Now, the key thing about the rupture or the divorce, the forcible separation of nature and people, is what happens after the separation. is the law then establishes these institutions. And it is the law that establishes a new commodified relationship between nature and people and between people and people. And that is why these two institutions are instrumental, two sides of the same coin, in establishing a new kind of relationship with nature and between people. And that is why we need to look at these institutions and the laws that establish them very, very closely. Very often we think, oh, law is a secondary thing. Law is an instrumental thing. You have the problem, you have statistical analysis, you understand the problem, and then you can somehow fix it by bringing a legal solution to it. And that is a hugely problematic thing. That is exactly, going back to Einstein, trying to find our solutions by remaining at the same level of thinking. Lastly, I want to emphasize the importance of place in anything that we do, and in our conceptual world, the importance of bringing back place. Why is that? Because when nature and people are separated, then they are placed into new institutions, as I have already said. Their bond is broken. The bond between people and the bond between nature and people is broken. Throughout human history, people have produced goods and commodities, and they have produced goods and commodities by bringing nature and labor together to produce all the wonderful crafts, goods, services, culture, music, art, philosophies, you name it. And that is the basis of the extraordinary diversity that the world had before capitalism came and brought in monoculture and everything that is possible to find. So place is a bond between people and nature. Place is a bond between people, and that is what creates it. And commodification breaks that. When that is broken, then you have this crisis that you have invited me to speak about: migration, extraction, and climate. So the challenge in anything that we do is not to find another law, not to find another way of carbon certification or whatever, but to ask ourselves, does this help us to re-establish bonds between people, bonds between nature and people? And that means a fundamental transition in our consciousness and in our thinking, going beyond our present mode of thinking to new and different ways of grappling with this problem. These are some very, very big issues. I don't have time to go beyond that, but I hope I have said something that really speaks to the problems that you have put on the table for us to discuss today. I'll stop there, and maybe we can have more clarifications in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Radha. That was such an illuminating exploration of how to approach the issues that we'll come to engage with in more granular detail later. If you're interested in engaging further in Radha's work, then would highly recommend reading her 2018 book, What's Wrong with Rights? Social Movements, Law and Liberal Imaginations, published by Pluto Press. The book explores rights discourses and transformations in transnational finance capitalism since the World Wars, with a sharp interrogation of the connection between the two. Next, we're delighted to welcome Nadine El-Enany. Nadine is a senior lecturer in law at Backpack School of Law and co-director of the Center for Research on Race and Law. Nadine teaches and researches in the fields of migration and refugee law, European Union law, protest, and criminal justice. Her current research project, funded by the Liverholm Trust, focuses on questions of race and criminal and social justice in death and custody cases. Nadine has written for The Guardian, the LRB blog, Pluto blog, Open Democracy, Media Diversified, and Critical Legal Thinking. This evening, Nadine argues the ways in which immigration law and British nationality are a direct product of colonial theft. She begins with a personal account of her familial heritage. Extracting ideas and research from her brilliant book, Bordering Britain, published by Manchester University Press in March 2020, Nadine's presentation demonstrates how the racialized poor are subject to the operation of internal borders, revealing them as forms of imperial subjugation and violence.
My parents travelled from Egypt to Britain in 1977, moving from London to Exeter, a city in the southwest of England, in 1978. My father tells me that when they arrived in Exeter, they were struck by its natural beauty, combined with the peace and quiet of this rural city. For my parents, Exeter was a place they felt fortunate to have found, an idyll which could not be further from the noisy, crowded streets of Cairo. Immediately behind their house, farmland stretches out as far as the eye can see. They made Exeter their home, yet when my father retired, a neighbour asked him when he would be going back to Egypt. My parents have lived in the same suburb for 40 years. Even so, this neighbour has been quietly waiting for my parents to one day pack up and go back to where they came from. Still, my parents are the lucky ones. They have British passports. They came to Britain on an aeroplane, study visas in hand. They did not have to travel by boat or in the back of a lorry, in secret, risking their lives. Bordering Britain is thus not only a centuries-long legal and political process, it is also a mindset. Hanging over my parents will always be the assumption that their life in Britain is contingent and temporary. Immigration law in particular teaches white British citizens that Britain and everything within it is rightfully theirs. Others are here as guests. I challenge law's lesson that some people are entitled to space, resources and opportunities, and others are not, by showing how British immigration and nationality law is an extension of British colonialism. I argue that Britain's borders, articulated and policed via immigration laws, maintain the global racial order established by colonialism, whereby colonized peoples are dispossessed of land and resources. They also maintain Britain as a racially and colonially configured space in which the racialized poor are subject to the operation of internal borders and are disproportionately vulnerable to street and state racial terror. Britain is thus not only bordered, but also racially and colonially ordered through the operation of immigration control. Britain would not be the wealthy, plentiful place that it is without its colonial history. Colonialism and slavery were key to its industrialization and the growth of its capitalist economy. In 1833, Britain abolished slavery only to raise the equivalent of £17 billion in compensation to be paid to British slave owners for the loss of their property. The compensation scheme was the largest state-sponsored payout in British history until it was superseded by the bank bailouts of 2008. The funds paid out built and infused Britain's commercial, cultural, imperial and political institutions. Wealth derived from British slave ownership has by no means been evenly distributed in Britain. It has helped to enrich and sustain elite institutions, individuals and families, and has sown inequality deep into the fabric of British society, helping to make it the most unequal place in Europe. Yet, Britain's healthcare system, welfare state, transportation infrastructure, cultural and educational institutions, battered and unequally accessible as they are in the wake of privatisation and austerity policies, are colonially derived, along with the private wealth amassed over the course of the British Empire and retained after its defeat via systems of inheritance. The 1960s, 70s and 80s are particularly important decades in the story of immigration law and the making of modern Britain. As colonial populations fought the British from their territories, British lawmakers fast abandoned the myth of imperial unity and equality and moved to introduce controls targeted at racialized colonial subjects and Commonwealth citizens. This legislation culminated in the 1981 British Nationality Act, which raised for the first time the spectre of a post-imperial, territorially defined and circumscribed Britain. It severed a notionally white, geographically distinct Britain from the remainder of its colonies and Commonwealth. Through the concept of patriality, the 1971 Immigration Act had made whiteness intrinsic to British identity. Only patrials, a concept invented for the 1971 Immigration Act, those born in Britain or with a parent born in Britain, had a right of abode and therefore a right of entry and stay in Britain. In 1971, a person born in Britain was 98% likely to be white. The 1981 Act continued this process of racial exclusion by constructing British citizenship on the foundation of the 1971 Act's concept of patriality, tying citizenship to the right of entry and abode. The move was both materially and symbolically significant. A territorially distinct Britain and a concept of citizenship that made Britishness commensurate with whiteness made it clear that Britain, the landmass, and everything within it belongs to Britons conceived intrinsically as white. The 1981 Act did not therefore signify an end to British colonialism, but was itself a colonial manoeuvre. It was an act of appropriation, a final seizure of the wealth and infrastructure secured through centuries of colonial conquest. Understanding Britain as a contemporary colonial space in this way serves to partially collapse the distinction between settler and non-settler colonial contexts. While it is now an accepted argument in critical scholarship that settler colonialism is ongoing and structural, the same critique has not been applied to non-settler forms of colonialism, which are considered to have ended. Yet, the border drawn around the spoils of British colonial conquest via immigration and nationality law amounts to an unredressed act of colonial theft. Due to mainstream understandings of property as being fixed and immovable in space and time, theft via the passing of immigration controls can be difficult to conceptualize. Along with the resources and labour stolen in the course of colonialism, the social and cultural networks and relationships that were annihilated or radically reformulated as a result of colonial conquest were also material losses. Colonial dispossession not only determined the contemporary distribution of material wealth, but also radically altered subjectivity in the sense of what people desire, consider themselves as entitled to, and understand themselves to be. Theft of intangibles such as economic growth and prospects, opportunities, life chances, psyches, and futures occur in all colonial contexts, settler or otherwise. The effect of the 1981 Act, along with changes to immigration law, was to put the wealth of Britain, gained via colonial conquest, out of reach for the vast majority of people racialized through colonial processes, most of whom with geographical or ancestral histories of British colonialism. Immigration law not only serves as the means of obstruction of movement, it is also the means through which legal status is granted. While critiques of recognition are well established in settler colonial studies, the same critique has not been made in relation to Britain. Regimes of legal status recognition, whereby British authorities determine entitlement to statuses such as citizenship, settlement, or indefinite leave to remain, or refugee status, serve to legitimize the claim that colonial wealth, as it manifests in Britain, belongs behind its borders only to be accessed with permission. Similar to the way in which Indigenous people in Canada and Australia must submit to the rules and evidentiary standards of those colonial legal systems in order to be recognised as having enforceable rights to land, those with ancestral, geographical and personal histories of British colonialism who wish to access stolen colonial wealth and resources in Britain must submit to the rules and evidentiary standards of British immigration law. In this way, a facade of racial inclusion has been built in the form of paths to legal status recognition, which dole out immigration statuses to select racialized people who can fulfill certain criteria. Such recognition is always on the terms of the colonial state. Meanwhile, the vast majority of racialized people are prevented from accessing Britain and its wealth, in part through the operation of internal and external borders produced and enforced through law. The bestowal or extension of British subjecthood or citizenship in its current guise can thus never be anything other than a colonial act. In the colonial era, British subjecthood was held up as a superior category from which the civilizing benefits of British rule flowed. Yet British colonialism was genocide, mass murder, slavery, dispossession of land, exploitation of labour and theft of resources, all predicated on white British supremacy. Even so-called free British subjects seeking to move to different parts of the British Empire were met with racist immigration laws in places such as Canada and Australia, which heavily influenced Britain's first immigration law, passed in 1905. British subjecthood did not therefore protect racialized subjects from the violence of white British supremacy. Its very existence as a legal category was a manifestation of that violence. Whenever it has suited the British government, it has treated its subject as aliens for legal purposes, evicting them from the scope of legal status and protection with devastating consequences. The effect of the hostile environment policy, for instance, was to deny many of the Windrush generation and their children access to healthcare, housing, employment, and other vital services, and to detain and expel them. The traditional acceptance of legal categories, as defined in international and domestic law in and outside academia, has the effect of concealing law's role in producing racialized subjects and racial violence. It further impedes an understanding of law as racial violence. Take, for example, the category of the refugee, relatively valorized as compared with the irregularized migrant. Individuals falling outside the legal definition of a refugee are often described as illegal or irregular or economic migrants, and are at risk of being removed and denied access to healthcare, housing, and work. A decision to deny legal status carries serious, sometimes fatal consequences, and can be a politically expedient move on the part of a government seeking to apportion degrees of belonging, entitlement, and exclusion among populations under its control. Addressing the historical contingency and artificiality of legal categories, the violence in their production, and ongoing material effects, allows us to understand how Britain remains colonially and racially configured. It also helps to mitigate against the liberal politics of recognition and opens the way for the development of emancipatory and reparative discourses and strategies for migrant solidarity and racial justice. Legal status does not alter the way in which racialized people are cast in white spaces as undeserving guests, outsiders, or intruders, as here today, but always potentially gone tomorrow. Immigration law is, after all, the prop used to teach white British citizens that what Britain plundered from its colonies is theirs and theirs alone. Immigration law is not therefore the seemingly harsh but fair mode through which the deserving are separated from the undeserving. Instead, it is a crucial mechanism for ensuring that colonial wealth remains out of the hands of those from whom it was stolen. Understanding that immigration law is an extension of colonialism enables us to question Britain's claim to being a legitimately bordered sovereign nation state. If we, as critical scholars and activists, can imbibe a counter-pedagogy to that of immigration law and bordering, one which rejects the violence of legal categorization and paves the way for a more empowering, redistributive, and radical politics of racial justice, we can begin to work our way towards new strategies for organizing collectively in the service of anti-racism and migrant solidarity. We should not wait for the law to rule on our entitlement to colonial spoils. A Britain understood as the spoils of empire already belongs to us.
Thank you, Nadine, for such a lucid presentation on the intersections of British immigration law and colonialism. Nadine's work feels ever more pertinent today in light of recent political events. In a report released by the Financial Times, it revealed that the UK's Home Secretary, Priti Patel, asked officials whether it would be possible to process the asylum applications of refugees on an isolated volcanic overseas British territory, Ascension Island. In addition, she has appointed a former Royal Marine, Dan O'Mahony, to the role of, quote, clandestine channel threat commander, end quote, to monitor and track individuals crossing the channel. In her own words, making this route unviable, further adding to an environment hostile to refugees and asylum seekers. We'd also like to take this opportunity to recommend Maya Goodfellow's book, Hostile Environment, published by Verso last year, which offers another stirring critique of how immigration has become a political scapegoat in the UK under the disastrous hostile environment policy.
Our next speaker, curator, researcher and artist Angela Chan, is a creative climate change communicator. She collaborates widely with artists, activists, speculative fiction authors and youth groups. She holds an MA in climate change from King's College London and researches across decolonial climate justice, geography, feminist sciences and speculative fiction. Angela independently curates Worm, Art and Ecology, which she explores in more detail during her presentation this evening. Through Worm, Angela uses creative practice, exhibitions, public programs, speculative fiction and visual arts to explore critical climate issues. Over to Angela.
Hello everyone, thanks to System of Systems for the invitation to share some of my thoughts today, and I'm looking forward to talking more with the rest of the session's guests. Firstly, I'll introduce to you a little about what I do. I'm a creative climate change communicator, which describes a range of my projects focused on intersectional perspectives of climate change in historical and cultural contexts. I do this through curatorial programming and public workshops as Worm, Art and Ecology, as well as science fiction research and coordinating the London Chinese Science Fiction Group. I also have my own art-making practice, which is research-based with collective engagements. So I'll begin by exploring some of the overarching themes and inquiries throughout my different projects to offer an insight into how I think about climate change and how this relates to the processes of extraction and migration that are relevant to this session. I'll also highlight some of my most recent activities in both my curatorial Worm, Art and Ecology work and an upcoming project from my own arts practice. These will further build a picture of how I use creative vocabularies to communicate our urgent climate issues. Working within the intersection of climate change work and the arts, I've come to realise that there are many parallels between the two. On one hand, the climate movement and the arts both seek to engage audiences with realities and speculations of today's urgencies. However, on the other hand, there are systemic barriers in both that restrict who is participating in the mainstream to generate, share, and eventually archive the types of experiences and knowledges that exist. The white supremacist, patriarchal, and ableist structures that have permeated from the elitist beginnings of Europe's cultural sector and the Enlightenment-birthed environmental movement here negate and erase the cultures, histories, and experiences of resistance of its former empires. This is in order to continue their neoliberal and ideological thriving, even in this current moment of overlapping global crises of climate change, racial injustice, and the global health pandemic. With this in mind, it is essential that working to communicate climate change issues through the arts must centre and be accountable to the people who have been calculatedly minoritized from both the climate movement and the arts sector. One way that I address this in my work is through emphasising a need for a multiplicity of perspectives amongst simultaneously existing timelines. This means talking about our histories, presents, and futures in their plural forms, such that there is no singular, hegemonic narrative that tells of one experience only, one that most of us do not relate to. Holding space for many coexisting narratives and climate knowledges across the borders of intergenerational time and our geographies also recognises how they co-shape one another and our near futures together. I work with SF, science and speculative fiction, but only when we speculate our futures in line with climate justice can we anchor them to the lived realities of those for whom climate change is already a science fact. Therefore, I work to recenter experiences that have been marginalised by the uneven developments of socio-political, economic, and cultural powers that sustain the crisis. Creative projects are one way to communicate and share across our borders in solidarity and to incubate new forms of resistance by distributing and redistributing the power to imagine beyond the now. Now I'll take you briefly through a recent curatorial project, Climate Knowledges, and also talk a little about my creative workshopping projects with young people on intersectional climate perspectives. Here you can see two versions of the exhibition, which I organised with a free programme at MAMA, Media and Moving Art in Rotterdam. Two game designers of the MAMA Young People's programme, Louisa and Naomi, came up with a suggestion to design a virtual version as the site at the gallery closed for COVID-19 lockdown a week after its opening. With their project, you can visit the exhibition online. I'll show some images of the digital and on-site space, displaying the artists and the activists involved as I give an outline to the ideas of this project. There were a few questions that initiated my thinking around climate knowledges. What constitutes knowledge about climate change? Who is in control of producing and sharing information? How does this information benefit or compromise marginalized groups? Again, I emphasize the need for plurality, with the title's indication that there exists many knowledge systems in varying forms. For example, understandings about our climates have long existed as embodied experiences and knowledges shared across generations. This project identifies some of these timeline narratives through contemporary climate issues in different continents and that are held to us here in Europe through our diasporic relationships to our lands, people, as well as our complex complicities. Together with 3 visual artists, a science fiction writer, and 5 climate justice activists, Climate Knowledges looks to the past to shape our futures, and we explore alternative ways to think about the power dynamics in narrating the climate crisis. Through speculative ways of storytelling, from ancient mythologies to futuristic science fictions, the exhibition confronts the colonial and patriarchal origins and their exploitative processes that produced and sustain the current climate crisis. In this project, Annie McKinnon expands on Chinese mythologies and philosophies to re-articulate our entanglements with the environment and critique exploitative techno-futures. Regina Canyu Wang imagines interspecies knowledge systems and communication methods through her queer ecology science fiction story that was adapted as a sound piece for the exhibition. Jessica Elmau challenges the boundaries of contested borders around the Strait of Gibraltar to determine the history of legal treaties, geopolitical policies, economic developments, and land acquisitions against the backdrop of ecological issues. And Josepha Natam traces the monster in a time of cyborgian hybridity and climate change, drawing upon Drexican myths, Mamiwata, and colonial histories of Central and West Africa. She narrates fictions and truths towards a decolonial transfeminist empowerment. This curatorial project also establishes a climate visual cultures library with Indigenous and climate activists of colour who organise in the Netherlands. They include Fossil Free Culture Netherlands, the Stoppen Steenkool, Free West Papua Campaign Netherlands, and activists and artists Teresa Borosino and Chihiro Gersbrich. It is an evolving archive of visual material from direct action campaigns with contributions so far spanning posters, pamphlets, stickers, texts, song lyrics, and even a policy printed toilet roll. It presents the long and ongoing history of the climate justice movement led by Indigenous, Black, and people of colour who show that climate resistances are inseparable from the wider global social justice, human rights, and decolonial independence campaigns. Part of reclaiming the power to narrate climate timelines is what I see as our radical self-archiving of existing political actions and ideas. If our histories and presents are sidelined or homogenized together as outside the mainstream climate movement in Europe, our practices to creatively document ensure that they are written. Ultimately, the exhibition re-evaluates the climate crisis and questions how we got here, where we will be, and critically, who are included in this we. In my other work as Worm Art and Ecology, I also work more directly with people to facilitate projects that aim to break down seemingly large climate themes into more relatable everyday actions. In our discussions, I ask youth groups to think about how we relate to climate change through our understandings from the news, pop culture, school, and our peers, and what kind of varying perspectives these climate narratives come from. I ask if they, as young people, feel included in the growing climate movements that they observe? Who is left out? Together we draw relations with racial and social justice issues to ask what their kind of inclusive youth activism with climate change would look like, even if simply through daily moments of awareness. How do we combine intersectional politics with climate issues? These projects' creative directions and topics are led by the young people themselves. I have previously worked with the Art Assassins South London Gallery's weekly meeting youth group, and I shared a summer workshop series that focused on colonial histories, race and climate issues, and also what inclusive world building through science and speculative fiction could bring as a creative response. Their collective self-assigned project became a comic book, which explored the flaws of geoengineering, greenwashing and techno-capitalism, complete with flashback storytelling techniques and hand and digital drawn pages. Over the past recent 5 months, I have been working with the Raw Minds ambassadors who meet through the Welcome Collection. With a focus on intersectional perspectives, we explored what the climate crisis means in the context of the other overlapping global crises today. The young people organised a webinar event for other 14 to 19-year-olds with invited speakers on the topics of food, sustainable fashion and futures. I feel it's really exciting to work with young people as they critically engage with intersectional climate issues and in turn seek to communicate their own understandings to inspire a wider awareness amongst others in their generation. I'll finish by sharing the beginnings of a project I'm developing as part of my own art making practice. This one is for Gerwood Arts and FACT Liverpool's digital fellowship for the next couple of months. Recently, I have been thinking about resource scarcity and the types of climate awarenesses we collectively hold in our communities that are often invisibilised. I'm developing a new project that highlights the UK's imminent water scarcity, public awareness and behavioural changes towards everyday participation in climate justice, especially amongst systemically marginalised groups. It is titled Moss Rain Paradox and will be a short video work with an accompanying interactive body of research. In June 2020, the UK's Environmental Agency published a report titled The Great British Rain Paradox, and with it, and I quote, "A nationwide survey of 2,000 British adults has revealed a paradox that 77% believe the UK is a wet and rainy country, but in reality, our demand for water could soon outstrip supply. The next 25 years could see the UK's water scarcity worsen due to climate change and population growth." End quote. But I challenge the latter reason for prevalent high wastage behaviours, especially amongst state and corporate activities, rather than individual citizen consumption. I also critique the dangerous eco-fascism that arises in linking climate impacts and population growth. The project's humanising stories and research would come from my interviews with water experts, geographers, water companies, and Black and Indigenous people of colour climate justice activists, as well as citizens across the UK regions. I would explore nationwide emotional developments of eco-anxiety that centre our intergenerational and diasporic memories of water before our near future shortages. The project prioritises different understandings of water practices from Black, Indigenous and people of colour, disabled, working class and LGBTQIA+ communities who are the most disadvantaged by climate change. I also explore moss as an organic environmental sensor through a speculative element to the video. It brings together the tactility of this soothing non-human, rehydrating our bodies, the land, and moving through timelines of data, technologies and geographies. My research-based practice includes video recordings, interviews, drawings, and also environmental remote sensing and GIS data visualization, and the speculative fiction writing surrounding the moss. I hope the project can be one way to bring inclusive climate communication through co-learning these climate knowledges.
Thank you, Angela, for such a lovely insight into your brilliant worm. It's great to see how the project engages with younger voices from such diverse backgrounds who will be increasingly harshly hit by the deleterious impacts of the climate crisis. You can still virtually visit Angela's exhibition with Mama, Climate Knowledges, through their website. Next, and rounding off tonight's presentations, we're delighted to be joined by artist and researcher Nabil Ahmed. Nabil leads Interpret, a research and design studio for environmental justice that advocates for criminalizing ecocide, a term used to describe crime against the natural environment. The group's long-form research and investigations have been exhibited most recently at the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw and Beirut Art Center. He's written broadly for Third Text, Routledge, Documenta, and Sternberg Press, among others. He has taught and lectured extensively in the UK and internationally, and is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Trondheim Academy of Fine Art at Norwegian University of Science and Technology. This evening, Nabil will discuss the context of contemporary Bangladesh as an emerging peripheral economy. It's one of the most vulnerable countries to sea level rises and other ecological disasters, yet a ruling class and multinational corporations together are accelerating irreversible damage to both human and non-human life. Over to our final speaker, Nabil.
Migration, extraction, the climate are bound together in direct and indirect ways. If we are to arrange these links in such a manner as to show their cause and effect, then we could say extractive capitalism-driven global heating is transforming patterns of migration in the global south. But if fossil fuel capitalism is the fundamental driving cause of greenhouse gas emissions, unless we deal with this, then the poverty and violence associated with environmental migration will continue to intensify. Interpret, a research and design studio which I run, uses spatial analysis and science to undertake environmental advocacy work in fighting extractive projects. And as part of the Stop Ecocide campaign, we advocate for a new ecocide law to sound ways of holding big oil accountable. Imagine how for a moment the socially responsible image sought after by fossil fuel corporations might not hold up too well once their CEOs are legally challenged as climate criminals. If international criminal law in particular, and litigation in general, is an emerging kind of tool in the climate fight, then to win it, we need to connect it to a much longer struggle being waged by people's movements, building mass social power in the global south against coal power plants, mining, toxic waste sites, and agribusiness. This is what I want to talk about today. It's plainly obvious which word might be chosen as the Oxford Dictionary's word of this year. But in 2019, the Oxford Dictionary had declared climate emergency as its word of the year. Extraction is not related to COVID-19 the same way as it is to the climate emergency. Yet they all lay bare society's racial and social inequalities. Both emergencies, one sudden and the other with a slow onset, are disproportionately harming Black, minority, ethnic, and indigenous groups. In the words of Bangladeshi economist and activist Professor Anu Muhammad, who for decades has shown light on the culture of impunity and dispossession, quote, "Global hegemony is about a one-way relationship, an unequal exercise of power by one or a few persons over many others, a concentration of wealth and power in some parts of the world at the expense of many," end quote. In Bangladesh today, as in other peripheral economies that were integrated into the global capitalist system, there are more supermarkets than manufacturing industries, more hybrid seeds than local variety, more private schools, universities, and hospitals than public institutions, more working women than women's income and wage security, and more consumerism than locally produced goods. In the 1970s, at the same time as Western environmental consciousness was rising, working class power was beginning to be undercut by capital. Across the global south, the free market agenda of structural adjustment, deregulation, and privatization brought unfettered foreign direct investment into oil, gas, and the service sectors. The climate emergency is the proper noun for this hegemonic relationship. In poor countries that are some of the most vulnerable to the impacts of sea level rise, the ruling class and multinational corporations are accelerating the plundering of people and nature. In the example of Bangladesh, at the same time as the state is taking part in elite advocacy on climate change negotiations in international forums, it is opening up the Sundarbans, the country's last protection against cyclones and the rising seas, to global capital. One such extractive project is the proposed Rampal coal power plant, a joint venture with the National Thermal Power Corporation of India. The Sundarbans, located in the delta on the Bay of Bengal in southern Bangladesh, lies at the confluence of many of our great rivers. It is the largest single-tract mangrove forest in the world. The proposed plant's location is a mere 14 kilometers away from this UNESCO World Heritage Site. Since its inauguration in September 2013, the social movement organization, National Committee on Protection of Oil, Gas, Mineral Resources and Power Ports, have continued to lead resistance to the Rampal project through vigorous and sustained campaigning. The National Committee's work thus represents new forms of democratic resistance against neoliberal capitalism in the environmental arena. A second coal-fired power plant in the climate-vulnerable coastal Cox's Bazar district is planned by the Japanese corporation Sumitomo. According to Mighty Earth, the coal power technology would not be allowed in Japan's own territory, as it would pollute up to 21 times the amount of sulfur dioxide and 10 times the amount of deadly particles than an average new coal plant in Japan. Yet a third project in Rupur, the Rupur nuclear power plant, to be built by Rosatom at the cost of over $14 billion on the banks of the Padma River, is only 87 kilometers from Dhaka, potentially impacting 100 million people. But with an energy-hungry large population, what alternatives are on the table for Bangladesh against what Mohammed has called projects of mass destruction at the service of global capital? In 2017, the National Committee made clear demands for a people-centric extraction and energy policy for Bangladesh, a year before the Green New Deal would make waves on Capitol Hill. The core of the National Committee's power and energy plan is based on the pillars of anti-corruption, pro-nationalization of energy projects, and massive expansion of renewable energies and jobs. As the National Committee's activism demonstrates, what Bangladesh lacks is not a mass base for climate justice struggle, but a roadmap for translating struggle from the street to the institutional force of a political party, such as Podemos in Spain and left-wing populism in more broad terms. As Raj Patel and Jason Moore rightly note in their book, History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, quote, as he sailed through the Caribbean, Columbus lamented his ignorance about the potential commercial returns of its unfamiliar flora and fauna. But he could appraise one component of the fauna quite well, the humans. He knew how to control his indigenous captives, hazarded a guess at their capacity for work, and ultimately encouraged their export to Europe. Let us in the name of the Holy Trinity go on sending all the slaves that can be sold, he wrote to Ferdinand and Isabella after his second voyage. There is more slavery and associated crimes of human trafficking, forced labor, and neoliberal exploitation of cheap labor today than in the Atlantic slave trade. According to the International Organization for Migration, quote, traffickers are likely to recruit in such source areas of climate migrants, but also at their destinations, such as in urban slums, end quote. In 2017, Shaheen Khan and 100 other Bangladeshi men were lured by human traffickers to Vanuatu for lucrative construction work to be allegedly had in Australia and as far away as Cuba. Instead, the men were enslaved, tortured, and threatened with their very lives and made to work unpaid. Their tormentors, 4 Bangladeshi nationals, were eventually captured by the police and today face criminal charges in what might be one of the biggest trafficking trials to ever take place in the Pacific. In the summer of 2019, I was fortunate to be received as a visiting scholar at the University of South Pacific School of Law in Port Vila, Vanuatu. It is during this time that I met with Khan and the remaining Bangladeshis who were still stranded in Port Vila, mainly to serve as witnesses on the criminal trial. Literally everyone I spoke with from the victims of human trafficking said they suffered from bouts of depression and homesickness. Yet many were torn between the decision whether to return home and face crippling debts after spending their life savings to pay the traffickers, or whether to try to find work in Vanuatu. But what future prospects lie ahead for Khan and others in a country that is itself one of the most climate vulnerable in the world? We can't be sure whether climate change directly drove these men to fall victim to human trafficking, but the story demonstrates the desperation felt by many. What was striking about the Bangladeshis I met in Port Vila was that they were all men. Female rural to urban migrants, many displaced by storms, coastal erosion, and flooding, work in the country's mammoth garments industry worth over $28 billion. Out of close to 5 million low-wage workers, 80% are female. For the trade union leader of the Bangladesh Garment Workers Solidarity, photographer Thoslima Akhtar, neither the government nor the garments industry have learned the lesson of the Rana Plaza building disaster, which on April 24, 2013, just after 9 a.m., collapsed like a house of cards, killing 1,134 workers and injuring over 2,000. 7 years on, the government has yet to take accountability for the supply chain, just as garment workers' living wages are not secure. Quote, "Only a strong trade union movement can ensure workers' rights in Bangladesh," end quote, Akhtar argues. Who killed the 1,134 garments workers in Rana Plaza? That answer includes the factory owners, the Bangladesh Garments Manufacturers and Exporters Association, or BGMEA, a corrupt umbrella organization with power and money to bend laws to its end, the government, international buyers and retailers, neoliberal globalization, the building itself, and yes, arguably fossil fuel, capital-driven climate emergency. Perhaps this culture of impunity is embodied in another building, the 16-story BGMEA Bhawan, illegally built in the middle of a lake in central Dhaka. Its foundation stone was laid by the Prime Minister herself in her first term in office. 2/3 of Bangladesh is less than 5 meters above sea level. The climate emergency is a lived experience as people are driven further inland, displaced by erratic rainfall, riverbank erosion, or live precariously in the deltaic islands known as jars in Bangla. Yet landlessness is as much a consequence of poverty, land grabbing by corrupt elites, and industrial-scale shrimp farming, as it is spurned on by the climate change that create new patterns of displacement. In fact, landlessness has transformed Bangladesh's class composition. The choices are stark. Endure living along a battered shoreline under renewed threat from neoliberal globalization, such as the Rampal power plant, or move to the urban slums of Dhaka and resist labor exploitation. The final option, mostly for men, is to migrate outward, to reckon with what the journalist Christian Parenti has called the politics of the armed lifeboat, operative in the global north, which he described as, quote, "a kind of right-wing politics that acknowledges the environmental crisis, but that doesn't seek to deal with the fundamental causes of that. It just tries to adapt through exclusion and violence and authoritarian government," end quote. Vigilance against the eco-fascist political project of the armed lifeboat and the horrific and lethal violence it inflicts on migrant bodies at the maritime and land borders of Europe and the United States is necessary as ever. Yet, as the novelist Amitav Ghosh reminds us, quote, Asia's centrality to global warming rests, in the first instance, upon numbers. The great majority of potential victims are in Asia, end quote. There, in Bangladesh, India, and Vietnam, hundreds of millions of people are on course to lose their land and livelihoods. These are the concrete circumstances around which working people are making their daily struggle, and people movements and trade unions are organizing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nabil, for such a rigorous analysis of the ways in which corporate power and neoliberal governance are inextricably bound up in issues of extraction. If you're interested in reading more case studies that Nabil has engaged with, we'd highly recommend his recent article, Infrastructural Snare for Efflux Architecture, which was published in June of this year. It covers the violently extractive work that Shell Oil have been conducting in Ogoniland, Nigeria, and the social justice resistance work taking place by the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people. Now we'll move on to our live Q&A session, so do stay with us. Write any questions you'd like to put to our speakers in the chat, and we'll do our best to cover them all. See you shortly.